So the topic of our webinar today is the advantage of automation in cryostorage, which is a very important topic, as you know, as our industry strives to move forward with not only implementing new technologies, but also at the same time mitigating risk and reducing any potential burden on the staff as well as the medical practices. So today with us, we have some excellent speakers that are going to share their perspectives and their experiences with us and discuss some of those key points that we all are curious about, especially regarding, the involvement of embryologists and their work towards managing the inventory, not only with respect of time management, but also the overall burden of liability. And then some other topics that we're discussing is the safety aspect, and then also, introducing automation and whether or not the transition will involve heavy time training requirement needs on the staff, but then also, as far as the day-to-day operation and corporation is concerned, how burdensome is that shift, and then what are the pros and the cons. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speakers today in the order that they're presenting. We have Dr. Kimball Pomeroy. Dr. Pomeroy is the Chief Science Officer for IV fertility in the US and overseas, several IVF laboratories in the US. He has lectured at many scientific meetings and postgraduate courses and has co-authored papers dealing with COVID-19 and the IVF laboratory. Best practices for nitrogen storage tanks, risks of cross-contamination of microbes during storage of tissue in liquid nitrogen, the usefulness of embryo morphology in predicting pregnancy and the source of microbial contamination during embryo culture. Kim Pomeroy received his PhD in animal physiology at Colorado State University and then was a postdoc at the Salk Institute of Biological Sciences or Studies. At the Salk Institute, Dr. Pomeroy worked with Dr. Glenn Evans on the Human Genome Project, Chromosome 11, and did work in the production of transgenic animals. He was trained in Bristol, England as a human embryologist and has worked as a consultant for several projects in Mexico, Nepal, China, Bolivia, and the Bahamas. He has served as a member of the SART Executive Board, chair of the Reproductive Laboratory Technologists Group, chair of the College of Reproductive Biology, and the founding member of both Regulatory Task Force and the Southwest Embryologist Summit. Recently, he has focused his studies on what happens when cryotanks fail and how oocytes regulate their pH. Our second speaker is Dr. David Cragun. Dr. Cragun has over a decade of experience in fertility industry and is the laboratory director at Northern California Fertility Medical Center in Sacramento, California. He received his PhD in biochemistry, molecular and cellular biology from Cornell University, and his master's degree in clinical embryology and andrology from Eastern Virginia Medical School. And our final speaker today is Cynthia Hudson, an embryologist and medical technologist with over 20 years of experience in reproductive technology. Cynthia possesses a holistic industry perspective resulting from her diverse and comprehensive background. She has worked in a number of nations' foremost IVF practices and designed multiple IVF laboratories in addition to founding and operating innovative reproductive medicine centers. Prior to tomorrow, Cynthia was a founder and CEO of Manhattan Fertility Services, a full-service fertility center with an in-house IVF lab. Cynthia built and operated the practice while developing a pioneering patient experience and viable revenue streams. Her creation of a reference andrology laboratory, management corporation, and associated medical practice played a critical role in the center's growth and eventual sale. She applied the same holistic expertise as a co-founder of Kindbody, a revolutionary reproductive firm that combines best-in-class technology and clinical excellence and accessible pricing to connect the full patient experience on one intuitive platform. As co-founder and CEO of, as founder and CEO of Celavita, an assistant reproductive technology consulting service established in 2004, Cynthia offered a variety of advisory and laboratory services to a wide range of corporate and clients and domestic international clinical IVF programs. Cynthia is a member of multiple medical organizations, including the American Board of Bioanalysts and American Society of Reproductive Medicine, American College of Embryology. She's an active researcher, and she has made dozens of published contributions to leading scientific journals such as Fertility and Sterility, Human Reproduction, and the Journal of Assisted Reproductive and Genetics. Her work has also been featured in presentations at the American Society of Reproductive Medicine and European Society of Human Reproduction and Embryology. And with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Kimball Pomeroy to go ahead and begin with his presentation.
Thanks, Dr. Lee. I'm really grateful to be here with this panel. And I just want to briefly outline some of the issues. So if we can start with the slides. We're talking about cryo-automation. And as the Chief Science Officer for IV Fertility, I've been working this past year in trying to solve cryostorage issues for about 12 different clinics. Also in the past, I've spent a lot of time with clinics that I've worked with. I've developed a database system in Access that other embryology groups have used for maintaining cryostorage and for billing of patients. But I've got to tell you, there are a lot of problems with that issue, with that development of the software that I did. And I did it just as a hobby, basically. But it sure opened my eyes out into some of the problems that we have. So I'm going to try to go over some of these. I mean, I think we really got brought into this with some of the suits that happened against Pacific Fertility in the Cleveland Hospital. But these aren't the only cases. There's a lot of others. I've been involved talking with lawyers for other cases that have happened with issues in inventory or billing. These are just the publicized ones. But because these resulted, or at least one of them resulted in a multi-million-dollar settlement, we've soon realized that we have to act as a biotissue repository. We can't just store tissues and try to do the least expensive things for our patients. I think we did that with good faith, trying to save money. But I think when we realize how important this tissue is, we have to do whatever we can to maintain this tissue in a safe environment. I think all the panelists will agree here. So I wanted to talk about, first of all, what happens when we become a real tissue repository. And I've listed here some of the things that must happen. We have to have, in the past, I think we've had for inventory, we've had Excel or Access databases, but inventory almost never interacted with the billing. And it's a necessity. We must have a fail-proof system for recording what goes in the tanks, what is used, and what is moved to other sites, and what is discarded. We need some way to track our consents. And these consents change over the years. As I've gone and worked with infertility groups that have been in practice for over 35 years, I found that they might have 10 different consents. And how you handle those tissues, especially if you're going to ship them somewhere else or if you're going to discard them, you've got to go according to each of those consents that were signed. Billing in the past, this complexity was really difficult. And we needed to always correlate it with our inventory. We don't want to bill a patient that just had an embryo transfer of their last embryo, especially if that was a negative pregnancy. And then we must decide, how often are we going to bill these patients? Every year, biannual, or every month? And this is an important decision because the longer time between billings, the easier it is for the patient's recent address to become inaccurate. We often depend on the forwarding of bills from the U.S. Postal Service when someone moves. And the U.S. Postal forwarding is free for the first 6 months. And thereafter, there are charges. So most people will have their forwarding occur for a maximum of 6 months. And so we don't want to wait a year for billing and then not have a forwarding address for that bill. Next is shipping. A tissue repository must send out and receive tissue fairly regularly. They've got to have a system to keep track of all of these shipments and make sure they arrive on time. They've also got to have the appropriate things being done in their protocol to make sure that if something arrives that they're not expecting, they know how to handle it. And if something arrives damaged, they know how to handle that, especially in recording what went on and what was the cost. In shipping out, they must have an accurate method of determining that these tanks are good tanks, that they've passed a recent QC, and that they are full with liquid nitrogen when they leave. And next, we need to have a way of handling discards. Most of us, I think, have been afraid of discarding tissue for fear that we'll discard tissue by accident that wasn't meant to be discarded. But we're also liable if we tell patients we're going to discard a specimen if a bill isn't paid and we don't follow through. Patients sometimes, believe it or not, believe us what we've written into their contracts. And they feel that this is an adequate way for them to discard the specimen. I'm not saying this is how we should discard specimens, but this is how a patient thinks. And it could be that later on, if you go and you contact them, maybe you haven't contacted them for 5 years, they're going to be very upset to know that those specimens were not discarded when they depended on your contract that said we will discard if the bill is not paid. And finally, we have to have a method of doing searches. We have to have a way of finding patients, because patients will get lost. We move around a lot. You have to have a special department that puts a lot of effort into finding patient and that goes ahead and notes all of their steps in trying to find this patient, so that if they finally decide to discard after making many attempts, that they have some justification for that discard. Next. But more importantly, we never were biorepositories. We didn't act like it. We didn't charge like it or bill like it. And we didn't have the facilities necessary to be a true biorepository. Next. So here's what the issues have been for us in the past. We've done it cheap. We've tried to make it inexpensive for a patient. That's a laudable thing to do. But with the recent suits, we found out that's not really what patients want, unless we want to have a suit that could possibly bankrupt our entire infertility practice. We've had a really lack of inventory and billing linking up. A lot of times the billing department depends on us making a last minute check of inventory to see who they should and who they shouldn't bill. There's a lack of staff and attention. A real repository will have enough people to search for patients, to handle calls that come in, to make sure that when there's a movement of tissue from one place to another, it's logged in. Keeping track of this mobile society is very difficult. And so we need people that are going to go out and search for patients so that we can give them the best shot. If they want their tissue, we'll keep it on hand. And finally, we really have to examine our contracts and consents and make sure that they're up to date and going to help our patients and help us in following what their desires are. We have to remember that if we don't follow our consents because of fear, we're doing our patients and our practice a disservice. Next. And this is because we were never biorepositories. That doesn't mean we can't be one today. And this is one option that can happen. You can become a biorepository, but you're going to have the tools in place to do it properly. Next. So here are some facts that we have to deal with. People move frequently. They don't always pay their bills, either because they get lost or they're busy. Often they'll use non-payments as a method to discard specimens. And also, the clinics can't really play hardball and should not play hardball when a patient doesn't pay a bill. Sometimes it's best to have a separation of storage and billing from the clinic. That way they can really have patients decide whether they want to keep these specimens in storage and pay for the storage, or whether they want to discard them. And this is something that's very difficult for IVF clinics. These are things that I have found as I've been looking at what we need to do as IV fertility. Next. So we need to have solutions to all of those. And I don't care if you're doing it yourself or if you've hired someone else to do it. Solutions have to address those issues, and they're difficult issues, and they will take money. But we have to tell ourselves that we owe this to our patients. Thank you very much.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm David. I'm the lab director at Northern California Fertility in Sacramento. And just coming from a private clinic perspective, thought that I could share a few things. So you can go to the next slide. So we're obviously talking about cryo storage. You can go to the next slide. So this is just a picture of our cryo room, just like all of you guys have. We've got an assortment of different types of tanks, been acquired, kind of piecemeal one at a time over the years. They all function more or less similarly in terms of, the way that we store them. Samples bathed in nitrogen, we're not a vapor storage situation. It's attached directly to the lab, which allows us to monitor it, per CAP standards. We do twice a day visual checks and measure the tanks weekly and fill them, and measure the tanks 3 times a week and fill them weekly. So, we have 26 tanks on site, so we're kind of a medium-sized clinic, not huge, but not small. But we are on the old school front of things, where our tanks are measured manually, they're filled manually, so our embryologists are responsible for the upkeep of the tanks and the maintenance of the tanks and the filling of the tanks as well. So that does, as we're talking about, poses, challenges. We have training issues. You can go to the next slide. We have training issues, with our embryologists and everything that need to be maintained, as well as the normal maintenance and how we document everything. This is just a snapshot of our database, which we're, again, kind of on the earlier front of things, where we're using an older Excel database that's manually updated by our embryologists at the end of each cycle. It is backed up onto a server, a physical server and a cloud server daily. So if something were to happen to this Excel document, we would be able to go back and find an old backed up version of it. And then that has happened in the past. And so, this is a situation that certainly is an older way of documenting things that could be updated. And so you can go to the next slide. But that presents challenges as well, because we have 26 tanks and 11,000+ embryos in the tanks, and the idea of moving that database from one place to another presents its own set of challenges. That's something that could be addressed, and as human error, as that data is moved from one system to another system, making sure that that's done in perfect is hard to accomplish. So we have issues with embryologist training. We have storage space just like everybody else. We're all doing PGT now, freezing embryos singly, which increases the volume of storage that we have. We have all these human error things where, databases are updated manually by our embryologist, but, how do you have a second person come through and do a double check on things in an efficient manner? There's computer errors, our servers could be breached. You can get viruses. You can have, a database that at one point is accurate that is no longer accurate because it's been breached by somebody. And so those are issues that we can run into. And then, as I mentioned, just moving things from one system to a new system presents its own logistical problems. With transcription errors, transportation risks. Every time you move an embryo in and out of the tank, as we all know, you pose some risk to the embryo as well. And even if that risk is very low, when you're talking about moving, 11,000 embryos, those numbers become real. Next slide. And so, one of the first things that we did here at our own clinic was just to get a larger tank. So most of our tanks hold them on average about 150 goblets in them. There's a larger tank that we have that we can hold closer to 900 or 1,000 samples. The footprint is pretty similar in terms of the tank itself. This is just one solution. Again, already meeting the needs of our lab because it's the same system we're already using in terms of the nitrogen-based storage system. The canes are a little bit different, and it has posed some challenges if anybody's ever worked with these tanks. There are people who have issues with them, but it's served our purpose as well, at least in terms of the volume that we needed. And you can go to the next slide. And there's other systems, you know, lots of tanks that are available. Tomorrow's system, obviously, which Cynthia will go into, but lots of other systems as well. Next. And I think, you know, there's autofill liquid nitrogen systems, which have benefits, but also have challenges, as we know from some of the problems that have occurred at other labs as well. Next slide. And barcodes and QCs, which I think would be a really big benefit as well. But again, the challenges remain in terms of how do we take the already in storage samples and upgrade them to a system with using barcodes or some other way of tracking them. Next slide. And so, you know, in terms of databases, EMR solutions have come up with things. I mean, Kim talked about, you know, his own applications where he's developed databases for tracking inventory and linking those to billing. So there are other situations and other solutions that are available, but again, the challenges remain in moving things from our older system into these new systems, and overcoming that challenge has been difficult. Next slide. And then there is even offsite storage solutions, you know, ReaperTech and Fairfax and CryoFuture is the newer one, where you can send things offsite. And we talk about this regularly. Is it something that we want to start doing, and moving all of our embryos and eggs and sperm offsite for storage purposes, which pose challenges as well. So next slide. So anyways, you know, lots of challenges to address. I think that automation is wonderful technology, and I'm looking forward to hearing Cynthia talk a little bit more about how to bridge some of these problems and challenges of taking what we currently have in our inventory and then upgrading that system to something that may be more accurate or more user-friendly, but doing so without any of the human errors that need to come along with moving those things around. So yeah, I'm interested to hear and the discussion. So thanks.
Sure. Thanks, David and Kim. Dr. Ali helpfully provided a title for this talk, so thank you very much. I think we can go past the next slide. So I'm an embryologist, and I currently work for a company called Tomorrow Life Sciences. It is a fertility technology company, and as an embryologist, I have long dealt with all of the things that Kim and David were discussing. Like, how do you manage the fact that you are an embryology laboratory, you are an IVF center, and you are meant to treat patients and get them pregnant and send them on their way, and yet you are now basically, without sort of knowing about it, converted into a long-term storage and biorepository. And so, we've got this inherent disconnect between what our core competency is in being a treatment center and a facility that creates embryos and transfers them and freezes them. And then now we also have to be, cryotechnicians, and we have to maintain this, ever expanding repository. We've done ourselves a lot of favors by introducing better ways to freeze these tissues, right? We vitrify them now. We used to do a method of slow freezing. We've figured out that we, sometimes shouldn't put them back fresh, right? Like, maybe sometimes we should wait for the patient to baseline back to normal hormone levels, freeze the embryos, and then come back an additional cycle. So all of these things, and then, oh, by the way, we've figured out how to freeze eggs, and now we've got an entire class of humans that are coming into our facilities just for the purpose of long-term storage. And so they're not even really interested in providing what we thought was our core competency. It was getting people pregnant. they just want to do long-term banking. And so, we've been faced with all of these challenges, and we've all come up with different ways of dealing with, because we didn't have an infrastructure or a system that was native to the embryology laboratory. I know of no facility that was built with the cryostorage being, the center of the room. It wasn't the focus. It was, oh, we're going to freeze some supernumerary and we'll figure it out and we'll kind of put it over here. So I think, and we've kind of come full circle, and, I think we've gotten to a point, and, Dr. Pomeroy mentioned, we've had these issues, we've had certain scenarios where we kind of have to step up our game a little bit. And so, how do we do that? Like, what do we do? Well, we need tools, right? So we need tools to track and trace. We need tools to manage our inventory. And using some of these, sort of existing technologies and incorporating them into new workflows in new ways, you can now take, RFID, which is radio frequency ID tech, that wasn't something that, this company invented, but what this company invented was a way to use it to check things into and out of cryostorage, and providing that sort of immutable audit trail that you can now say, well, we know who did what and when. This specimen was created at this point, it was frozen at this point, it was checked into storage at this point, and the whole system updates the inventory automatically. And I think that's something that, is helpful, to solving a lot of the challenges that, we've been discussing. So next slide, please. Oh, that's just it. Okay, next slide. So how does that work? So it's kind of a holistic approach. It's, there's a hardware component and there's a software component. And so the hardware component there is shown here. There's, an automation where, the samples are, the automation is defining what the storage position is, and then using that lab where we're checking those specimens into and out of that storage system with, in some cases, on the right-hand side of the screen is our original version of the cryo robot, and that is slightly more manual on how to put things in and out. The one on the left is our newest version that we now have FDA clearance on, that actually you kind of load into a drawer. It's kind of like an ATM. You load the samples into a drawer, then the automation picks and places each container, each beacon, which is the analog of the cane and goblet or visitube, and puts it away. So now that you didn't have to figure out where it could go, and you didn't have to write it down. And, the software component of this goes to, well, what we want to do is reduce risk, right? We want to reduce number of steps in the workflow, and we want to reduce risk. So if I say to you, let's build a system, but put all of this into your Excel database and put all this into your EMR, and then go and put all of that into my system, you're going to tell me to go do something that I probably don't want to do. And so how about if we build a system that these systems talk to each other? So if you put that into your EMR, then, then the systems can talk to each other, and that way we don't have to enter data twice. So I am not work shy. I will work as hard as the next person, but I want to work smarter and not harder. So I don't want to enter the same thing twice, and neither do you, because A, it's more work, B, it's inefficient, and it introduces an element of error that we just don't need. We have enough, to worry about. Next slide, please. So again, I kind of touched on this. There's, each patient gets assigned a container, which is globally uniquely identified in the system. The devices are assigned to that container. The container is assigned to a position in storage. The RFID checks it in and out. And again, all of that information is a two-way integration back to the, back to your EMR. The container that we designed, the traditional cane and goblet, which I happen to have right here, is, a fairly loose construction. You would place the cryo devices into this, and then this goes into the tank, and you would manually apply a label, and you would write on that label, and whatever your identification scheme is. What we did was we took that container and we said, okay, why don't we make it, sorry, I can't know if you can see this, but it's a container that has a cap. There's a quarter turn driving screw on the cap, and that so things can't fall out. And we have done some studies to show that this is has more thermal stability than that goblet on the cane. Next slide, please. So again, it's, here's, creating some tools for an in-clinic solution to take care of, the inventory. We've extended that to an offsite solution. So now we are, we're going to open our second offsite storage location. So now the inventory that you have in the clinic, it's your inventory. Is it in the clinic or is it in the offsite solution? Because everything is checked in and out. So your inventory is updated in real time at all times. So you never lose sight of whether the fact that's on site or off site, because the check-in and check-out applies and pulls all the way back to your EMR. Next slide, please. And so again, just kind of a system where, one of the things I didn't mention is, with our system, the telemetry and all of the elements of monitoring are monitored by us as a company. It is also monitored by you, but we monitor those robotic systems 24 hours a day. So, in addition to providing a record of who did what and when, we can tie all of that back to the environmental condition and say, okay, the temperature was this, this is the person that did it, this is when it went in, this is when it went out. And so now you have this kind of record to give not just to the clinic or the embryologist, but potentially back to the patient that says, you know what, we've maintained thermal integrity, we have a record of it, we know exactly where it is, and back to the point of, issues with billing, there's nothing, there's no discrepancy, right? You don't have to wait for somebody to update an Excel spreadsheet. If it's in, it's in, and if it's out, because the inventory is literally updated and checked back out. We've done a great deal of work with a lot of the popular, I guess, EMRs that you normally have, because we do feel that it is a great part of the value proposition to not have to do things twice. And so you don't want to build a system that reduces overall risk and reduces the number of steps and reduces opportunities for error, and then introduce risk and opportunity for error and more work by making people enter things twice. So we've spent a great investment in integrating with, certainly some of the ones that you've lifted there, and then a bunch more. Next slide, please. So this is just an example of, an automation. So, without the Tomorrow system, David says, okay, this is going to be our labeling scheme, and this is how we're going to label the devices, and this is what we're going to type into the Brady labeler, and this is what we're going to put on the tag of the top, and this is, we're going to say maybe the last 3 letters of the last name, and then maybe it's the date of birth, or maybe it's the cryo date. And so each, he's going to come up with some scheme, and then he's going to, maybe he has a system where the information is sent to the Brady labeler. Maybe he does, maybe he don't. I don't know. We could talk about this after. But most people kind of type it in. Then he's going to go figure out which one of those tanks and where the space is that he could put that. And then he's going to walk into that room and he's going to open that, put it in there, and then he's going to turn around and he's going to have to write down where he put it. And so you can see where there's any number of steps where there could be a problem. There's a saying that, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, and what happens in cryo inventory stays in cryo inventory to a certain extent. But, there are any number of ways that these things can fail, and any number of compensatory measures that people put in place. One of the compensatory measures is, lots of clinics have a system where they put, before the patient can start the cycle, somebody physically goes and checks the inventory, right? Or before, the day before all the FETs, somebody goes and they pull all of the samples because no one wants the patient to come in and you can't find, the embryo that you want to thaw and transfer. So we've all developed these compensatory measures just to get over the fact that we're humans and we're well-meaning and we're really sweet and great, but we're fallible and we make mistakes, and it's just because of the fact that we're human. So, with Tomorrow, like, these steps are automated, right? So we've automated the generation of a unique ID for each of the cryo devices. We digitally link that ID to a specific container, which is again uniquely identified. The software assigns the position to a spot in the storage system. And the handling is dependent on the screening status of the tissues. So again, adhering to specimen safety, we want to make sure that specimens are handled according to, whether it's infectious or screened or unscreened. the automation, will place that into position, and then the location then gets sent back to the EMR. So the embryologist actually has to do very little on that end. And so, you don't have to figure out where it is. You don't have to figure out, you don't need to know where it is when you want it, because you just go into the software and say, I want to thaw this one, and then it kind of brings it up for you. Next slide. So, again, I mean, this is basically all of what, Dr. Pomeroy and Dr. Craig have discussed. We want to be able to have greater visibility and transparency into our inventory. There's a reason that, the College of American Pathologists and, HFEA in the UK basically say that you need to do an audit. Well, why do you need to do an audit? We need to do an audit because we're uncertain of exactly what is in that tank. And why are we uncertain? It's because we don't have really good systems of tracking them in and out. There's no benefit conferred to the patient or the specimen by going over there once a year or once every 2 years and pulling it out just to make sure you wrote down the information correctly. Like, we're doing things and we're adding risk and work, just again, to compensate for the fact that we don't have good tools in place. And I would, there's a standardization, I would say, relative problem in this industry. We all, David has a scheme, Kim has a scheme, everybody's got a different embryo grading scheme. We don't all do things the same. And, you guys have been in, as many clinics as I have. And, if you've seen one clinic, you've seen one clinic, and everybody's figured out a way to do it, because we haven't historically had all of that infrastructure built and in place for us. And so next slide, please. And, so here's, I pulled a quote from the HFEA. This is in the UK. It's extremely difficult to compare clinic success rates fairly, and because they depend on the patients being treated and the reason for their infertility. I think that's a little bit generous, but if you go to the next slide, here's our own authority, the Society for Assisted Reproductive Technology. Success rates should not be used to compare treatment centers. This is, I think, something that we need to kind of take to heart. We have developed this scheme, this 1992 Fertility Success Act, which said that all the clinics should prospectively report their cycle starts and then their outcome data. And yet the public, of which this information is available, is not supposed to use that to figure out what clinic to go to. I think we, generally speaking, owe them a little bit more accountability. And I think we have to just collectively figure out ways to get that. And next slide. And because I'm a huge advocate of expanding access to care, because I think everyone should have a path to parenthood if they want one. And I think we have to figure out a way to make this cheaper and more efficient and really work to improve outcomes. And I think that's it. Next slide. And thank you.
Those were excellent discussions. Thank you, everyone, for presenting your views. And we hit on some very important topics, and some of those that, of course, I have some follow-up questions on, but I'm going to go ahead and let Dr. Fernanda Pacheco just jump right in and maybe address our audience questions to begin with, and then we'll have some open-ended questions within the panelists and the moderators. Dr. Fernanda.
Okay, so first I want to thank our speakers for their lecture and slides, and thanks for being here with us. So the first question, I think, is for Dr. Cragun. Is it standard in your IVF lab to inventory each tank annually?
Yeah, we do an annual inventory. And we do find mistakes, and things are corrected. We reconcile that inventory with what's actually in the tank every year.
Okay, I saw that the second question you already answered, but maybe it's good to bring more discussion.
Sure.
How do you verify your Excel database for accuracy?
Sure. So it's the responsibility of the embryologist who's entering the data at the end of the cycle to validate the accuracy of the information going in. So we don't have a system where it's being double checked by a second person or anything like that. We do often catch errors, because there are occasionally errors that do go into that database. And at the time of frozen embryo transfer, when the database is being updated, those errors are caught and corrected. Also, like I mentioned, during our annual inventory, all of those differences get reconciled at that point as well. So.
Awesome. Dr. Kimball, do you want to add something on these two questions about annual inventory?
Cynthia's smiling. She probably knows what I'm going to say already because we've discussed this. I, like her, do not believe in an annual inventory. I think it is much too risky. It is so easy to just have one canister fall and you've just exposed, 20 patients, their embryos, to a bad environment. I think there are ways of doing an inventory on an ongoing basis, but I avoid inventories as much as possible, and I'll record if there is something that is incorrect. But let's say you do go ahead and you find a bunch that are incorrect. There's been a lot of storage. Are you going to spend all the time and danger in getting all the straws sorted out? I don't know. You'd have to almost stop what you're doing, stop doing everything to fix it. So I don't think an annual inventory helps a whole lot. I think a non-physical inventory is helpful. If you're trying to, you've got books maybe of your cryo storage and you're going to do an inventory against your Excel spreadsheet or the patient's charts, that's worthwhile.
Yeah, actually, that brings up a good point. So we were, you and I were together at SWES, and one of the questions I posed to the audience was, what if a patient calls the clinic and asks, how many embryos do I have? What's your source of truth? And there's a lot of different answers to that question. And so it's the paper record, it's the Excel spreadsheet, it's the EMR, it's this, and someone just walks over to the tank and kind of looks in there. And so I think, every time you duplicate that database, every time you have a backup location, you have an opportunity to have a mismatch, in your location. So you would not just necessarily have to audit this against the tank, you have to audit this against this. And so we build these, we've got these layers of things on that, again, to compensate for the fact that, we're just so scared about maintaining the integrity of that inventory. And, it's so easy to make a mistake. Oh, I put this in tank 4, canister 3, and then I wrote down that I put it in tank 3, canister 4. I mean, we're humans. I mean, that's what we do. And so when are you going to find that out, right? Are you going to find that out on the day of the transfer, or, before the cycle start, before on a random audit, or, we just have to think about ways. It's risk management. It's really what it comes down to, is risk management. Everything that we do is managing risk.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I have another question from Angelica Muri. She is our account manager in Brazil. And she's asking, what are the biggest concern about sending the samples to a third-party company for freezing? She wants to know, what are your opinion about this? If you use a third-party cryo.
I don't think anyone does that.
Mm-hmm.
No one does it. You're going to freeze it before you send it. You can't send it until it's frozen.
Yeah, but you use
I think maybe
third-party company for.
I think maybe the question was, would it reduce the risk because it takes the frozen specimens out of the hands of the laboratory and into a long-term storage facility? Now, perhaps the long-term storage facility has incorporated automation, or maybe not. Maybe they're inventorying the same way that the rest of us are, who are not privy to the updated technology. And so what are the risks there, in your opinion?
So it's a risk of storage, really, is what the question is, I guess. And there are risks. Every time you ship it, there's a risk. So if you're doing offsite storage, you can't do it very frequently. You need to have someone produce data, and I think I know someone that does, to show about how frequently, are they going to use stuff within 1 year, within 2 years, or within 3 years? And you don't want to ship stuff back and forth because that's another increased risk. But I think the big issue is a lot of the liability when you storage off-site, not all of it, but a lot of it goes into the hands of those that are managing that storage. And I say, welcome to it.
Yeah, I mean, property is what, 9/10 of the law, right? Possession is 9/10 of the law. I think, you're right. I mean, I think there's a way, again, this goes back to risk management, so if you freeze something, and then immediately send it off, it's an embryo, you're probably going to need it back, right? If you freeze an egg and you immediately send it off, what's the rate of return from your patients? So like you kind of have to do an internal look at your patient profile, like, are your patients coming back? You can look and say, okay, well, here's all the frozen embryo transfers I did in 2022, and here's all of the cryo dates balanced against those frozen embryo transfers. And how many times did we do a frozen embryo transfer of an embryo that was frozen at least 5 years? I mean, there's maybe it's very high, but maybe it's very low. So I think it's kind of a way to think about, or maybe it's 3 years. Like, what is the number after 3 years? What is the number after 1 year? And what's the difference between eggs and versus embryos? I think those are ways to kind of manage risk, right? If 5% of your patients are coming back for eggs every year, it might make sense to move those offsite right away. If 100% of your patients are coming back within 12 months for embryos, it doesn't make sense to move those embryos offsite, right? So, I think it's all a matter of balancing, your internal staff, your workflow, and then, your risk. But if you have a system where, again, it's still your patient's tissue, but it might be here or it might be here, but it's still yours. You still have 100% visibility, and then you could get it back. If the patient is coming back for patient number 2, it shouldn't be a surprise, to the clinic that patient is coming back. So then you would have time maybe to come, to get those patients back, the samples back into the clinic. But it's risk management, so it's, how do you handle, your time, your staff, your physical, footprint, and then how do you manage, dealing with the patients, then saying, this is what we've done, this is what we're going to do. And, you made an interesting comment before about the consents and, and discard. And I think we have to get to a place where we allow an active, so if we have an active consent that says, if the patient doesn't pay and the patient doesn't respond after X period of time, then it says in that contract that the clinic should discard that patient samples, then I think it's up to us to discard those patient samples. They've implicitly broken their end of the deal. And if we don't discard that sample and we turn around and we say, patient, can you tell me explicitly that you want me to discard this? And we're kind of breaking our deal with the patient. We're making them say actively where they were trying to tell us passively that they didn't want the tissue anymore. So, there's a way to think about, structuring the agreements, and there's a way to think about, if the patient doesn't want to make that active decision, but they've kind of made a passive decision by walking away, I think we need to respect that and figure out how to manage that, within our practice.
I think that's a great point, Cynthia, because actually we have a number of patients who come back to us and say, I stopped paying my bills so that you would discard them. That's why I stopped. And it does pose some pretty big problems for sure.
Yeah. I mean, so now you're liable, right?
Yep.
I should say, it may appear that I've come off as thinking that automation and offsite storage is the way to go. But when I look at our IV clinics that we have one clinic that does things on site, but they do things right. They have become a biorepository themselves, and they practice good protocols so that I feel very comfortable with them keeping those specimens on site. So you can do that, but you have to be able to invest in whatever David probably knows more about what they've invested in to be able to do it correctly. The biggest thing is staff, though.
Yeah, and also, I mean, like you said, risk management, right? If we're shipping embryos back and forth over and over again, every single time you do that, you lose control of your embryos, right? Every time I ship embryos offsite, I no longer have control over how they were stored. And I trust that the biorepository is doing that appropriately. But if the embryo doesn't survive on my end when I get it back, again, it was out of my control for long enough that I don't have a good explanation for why that may have occurred. And so risk management, like Cynthia said, and like you said, Kim.
And just to add a little bit to the risk management, as our industry is experiencing record number of cycles, I believe we've seen a growth across the board when it comes to volume. And sometimes this is due to the multiple types of cycles that you can do with one patient. You can freeze some of their eggs, you can biopsy some, you can transfer fresh, you can, there's so many options now. Now, with that, of course, there's a demand for more help, more hands in the lab. And the ratio in some labs of senior embryologists to the juniors or the new incoming personnel is just flip-flopped and poses a risk as it is. So related to that, as we struggle to meet the demands of the day-to-day operations, these juniors are oftentimes handling these specimens when it comes to inventory, or when it comes to shipping in and shipping out specimens without the proper training on handling frozen tissue. And I have, in my lab have received samples. The chain of custody doesn't quite match what the inventory is in the tank, and you call up the lab and ask these questions. So related to that, David, I would love to hear your input based on your experience. Like, what do you feel as far as the risks that we have in the industry right now, at least for the members of the industry that don't have an automated system, either due to cost or whatever else? Is it worth the continued risk that we currently have, with the challenges that we face in our fast-growing industry?
Sure. I mean, I think that the risk management certainly falls on training, right? So if there's labs out there that have junior embryologists that aren't fully trained or properly trained who are handling specimens, that's on the lab. I think that responsibility lies with the lab director and the supervisor to make sure that only trained people are handling specimens and that they're doing so appropriately. So, in terms of risk management, I mean, I think that there's a lot of liability in the tanks, but I don't think that the actual day-to-day management of the tanks is a huge burden. I mean, my embryologists don't spend a whole lot of time even measuring or filling tanks, and we fill tanks manually, with a tank where we were dumping nitrogen in manually, and it's only a couple hours a week, and so we haven't had any issues, thank goodness, knock on wood, but obviously it just takes one failure, one issue to completely change the way that we're approaching these things. And I mean, we follow all the appropriate guidelines, but that doesn't eliminate all of the risk, of course. And no amount of training can truly, I don't think, eliminate all of that risk. So ultimately it becomes, is the company comfortable with that liability sitting on site or not? And I mean, there is, we charge patients to store our samples here. So we are making money by storing them here, acting as a biorepository. But, I don't know if I feel that the burden is so large that my embryologist can't accommodate the need, at least in terms of the short stuff. Now, I think Cynthia brought up a great point where, there are certain sample types that, like eggs, for example, that we don't use very, very quickly. And it does maybe make more sense to ship those offsite. Similarly, long-term storage of sperm, we often ship those offsite because they often don't get used, or the use rate is so low that it makes sense. However, embryos, we are using them so quickly that it does make sense for us to keep them on site. So I think regardless of whether you decide you want to ship things on site or ship things off site or keep them on site, you still have to maintain the tanks that you have on site, because you're going to always have inventory that you're using for active cases, frozen transfers, and the same amount of required steps are going to be necessary to maintain that tank as all of the other tanks that I'm already maintaining, I guess is one perspective.
So just as a follow-up to that, Kim, do you believe with, the multiple labs that you are overseeing with your structure, in more of like a corporate setting, do you believe that there is a difference between the labs that have an on-site lab director versus ones that have an off-site lab director, as far as the involvement and the training? Because David is on site, and of course, that's an advantage, right? Having a director on site is an advantage. So that I do agree that risk is minimized because you're active and you're on site. But what about those labs? And there's a significant portion that don't have that's not an advantage to them. So how do you believe, would you comment on the risks there?
Yeah, I think that really depends on who's supervising the lab. I've been at some places where the lab supervisor is as good as any PhD, HCLD lab director could be, or even better than most of us. And I've been in other places where the offsite has almost no hands-on. They're there just to sign off. It's usually these types of labs where it's that ways. But some people just want to save money and they don't have the direction. To me, it's really an issue of, does that specific clinic and laboratory need some offsite direction, or do they have someone that has enough skills and has been around long enough, they know to handle these issues? So I wouldn't put it on just whether they're offsite or on-site, but the skills of those people.
I have a question from the chat. It comes from an embryologist from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. She's asking to Cynthia about the Tomorrow system. Is it possible to add samples to the space of a specific patient? For instance, the patient cryopreserve oocytes twice or 3 times?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, I mean, I'll take a step back. And David brought up, barcodes. None of us used barcodes to, we started typing Brady labels, right? But I mean, back in the day, we would write, on straws, we would handwrite labels. And so we've kind of evolved now into more of a digital identification. But, I think it's, to me, it's a little bit irresponsible to build some kind of a system that isn't backward compatible, right? So, if we built this system, and I'm speaking about Tomorrow right now. So if Tomorrow built a system that the only way to put a specimen into this container was that if it had a barcoded label, then that's really not going to solve, a lot or any of your problem, right? If I only give you a solution from here for the future, that's really not going to work. And so, what we did was take the system, and so you can now, all your existing inventory, you can assign those devices. I'm going to generate an ID sort of on the back end, but we don't relabel cryo devices. That's not how it works. But they are going to be then assigned to a container that has a digital label, and then I can track it that way. So, so your question is, the way we've designed this, it holds up to 8 cryo devices. So that could be, 1 embryo per device, 2 oocytes per device, however you want to mix and match, but there are 8 different devices that you can assign. And so if your first freeze only has, say, 3 devices, if the patient comes back for another cycle, you can assign the new ones to this container. And so you can add to the existing container that's in storage. So again, the devices are tracked uniquely, they're assigned to a particular unique container, and that all ties back to the patient. So you can have multiple cycles in this one container. That's a great question.
Awesome. I have another question. Hello. Sharing my experience with Tomorrow platform, the safety and risk management is amazing. Any deviation or temperature fluctuations, you get a call within seconds. It wasn't a question, it was a comment.
I actually have a question. Yeah, I actually have a question to that comment. So that is a remarkable feature of the automated systems, but with relationship to those large tanks that have autofill options and the option for the alarm that's built in to then send out a push notification or a text message to the user's phones. There have been cases in the past where I've learned other, like some member labs or other labs the alarm feature would not be properly maintained and can be manually shut off, which then created a problem for a specific lab that I'm thinking about. With the true automation, that should be disabled, like the alarm notification being manually turned off. So is that where the future of automation is, or are we still not there yet? Do users have the option of turning the alarms off versus forcing them to get whatever problem it is corrected?
Yeah, I mean, in our system, you can't turn the alarms off, you know, I mean, I know if you lose internet, I know if you lose power, I know, if your autofill system doesn't, and I would say this is the most common thing that we get sort of dinged about is, the autofill tries to top off and it can't because your supply is empty, so like half the company knows that you have an empty supply cylinder, I mean, the house is not burning down, the samples are fine, the temperature is fine, the level is fine, everything's fine, except it just didn't quite get the top off. And so we have a built-in sort of, everybody stand down, until noon the next day. If you don't correct it by noon the next day, we're probably going to start calling you, but it's, you can't turn that off. So I think, I mean, we don't have that kind of level of automation in other aspects of the lab. If you have, for your incubators, right? If you lose power, hopefully there's a backup, battery or a generator, in there, but do you know if it's been switched to generator power or not? I mean, does the clinic know, like, do you as a lab director or an embryologist know that you're running on generator power? I mean, maybe there's, I think there's an opportunity all around to increase our level of sensitivity, because what we want to do is build systems that are proactive and not reactive. We want to say, okay, hey, wait, maybe there's something not quite right. Let's go check it out. Whereas, if you get an alert that says, the temperature in your tank is, has hit the alarm and it's minus 150. Well, like, it's telling you of an existing problem. Like, we don't want to do that. We want to know that something has gone sort of awry way upstream of that, and then kind of have time to go interact. So we don't want to be reactive in the sense, we want to be proactive. And so I think, from an incubator standpoint, refrigerators, for, all of our equipment that we use to maintain and to do all of these, wonderful procedures that we do to build these families, I think, there's a tremendous opportunity in the industry to pull in more of that sort of proactive monitoring sense so that we can better ensure that the patient, gets a really good standard of care.
I have do we have another question, Fernanda, from the audience, or may I ask?
Not yet.
Okay, well, I have a question. Recently on one of the embryologist chat forums or social media posts, there was a comment that, there is a big drive in the industry towards automation, and while that is all the hype, there is a cost that's associated to it. Now, of course, we talked about risks and benefits and how the costs can, be explained and the benefits outweigh it. But then there was a segment on, how do we maximally adopt the systems that we have to become more efficient, and then we can have a great system so long as we improve efficiency. So I had some concerns with that, obviously, because one of the problems that we have in our industry right now is the burnout factor, right? We are doing so much, we have overextended our staff. And so if we take a step back from IVF and look at any other industry, any other profession, there is an incorporation of technology and some automation in anything. Even if we look at the medical side, you go into, a doctor's office or an ER, and there is like this automated style EMR that, based on all of the symptoms, will predict or suggest rather, a problem or a solution for a patient to the doctor. So that's another integration, that's an example. So why is there, in your opinion, why would you think that there would be such a pushback from IVF members specifically on this progressive, the progression that we're experiencing, not only in the automation of cryostorage, but any other technology advancements that we're introducing? And then just before you answer that, I'd like to give you an example. We had in the past, it's a very common scenario that a patient comes through and you thaw an embryo, and every now and again an embryo won't survive, and then you thaw a second embryo. When it's on paper, you've already done like the initial thaw, and then kind of in the in the moment you realize, oh, we should hurry up and thaw a second embryo, the patient's on their way, and then the embryologist may forget to thaw the embryo in the medical records or in the Excel file. And then this is not discovered until the inventory at the end of the year. So all of this time passes and you don't realize that your inventory is inaccurate. And then you're kind of at the mercy of, the staff doing, I don't know, 26 tank inventories all in 1 month for accuracy. So what are the risks there? So the first question is, what's the slow progressive nature of embryologists in wanting to adapt to new technologies? And the second one was just an example of a potential problem that we have when we don't progress forward. So I'd like to just hear the thoughts of each member, and then we can start with Kim, please.
Well, I mean, in terms of, I don't know about the pushback. I think, embryologists, I mean, we all like to think that we're doing things correctly, right? This is the way I was trained to do it. This is the way I was taught. And so I think I don't know what you want to call it, the pushback or the hesitation of adopting these new technologies is more, maybe for some anyways, maybe just that, what I'm doing is already working, right? I hear that all the time. What I'm doing is already working. So why do I need to do something different? And you really have to convince people that there's benefit, either, saving in times or money or whatever it is, that whatever the savings are there, whatever the benefit, but convincing an embryologist that this new thing is going to be better than what we're currently doing, I think you can get a little bit of a pushback from people on that front.
Yep, I think I'd agree with David that it's not so much a pushback from fear of technology. It's because in other countries, embryologists are called scientists. And scientists by nature are skeptics. They want to see evidence that something's going to work. I wasn't the first one that went out there and started culturing blastocysts when the work came out, and I'm glad I didn't, because a lot of people jumped on the blastocyst bandwagon, and they really were not set up, did not have honed in laboratory systems to handle blastocysts. I was not the first person to jump into vitrification, because our pregnancy rates were almost as good as what you got from vitrification. So I think a lot of us are skeptics by nature. We want to see the data. We don't want to experiment on our patients. And I'd say that probably, and I hope this doesn't come off sounding terrible, but it's often because we always have to oppose physicians that want to jump on the newest thing, because they have a desperate patient population. And if something like toadstools will increase pregnancy rates because of one research that they studied, and they didn't study it, they just read this paper, they'll want to jump on it. We tend to be more skeptical.
Yeah, I love the analogy there. Yeah, I mean, I think we've grown up this industry in let's say a relatively unregulated environment, right? I mean, there's an element of our fertility clinics that is, diagnostic component. We have andrology labs, we have endocrine labs, we have these are regulated by CLIA, in the United States. They're diagnostic tests. There's proficiency associated with it. It's governed by state and federal sort of laws. And then IVF kind of became, it was considered, and is still considered, kind of an extension of a medical procedure. And so an IVF cycle is not done for diagnostic purposes, and so it doesn't fall under all of the diagnostic schemes we have for licensing and regulating these things. So I think that's an underlying sort of part of it. But we've not done a great deal of help for ourselves in this industry by, like, as you say, we adopt new things. Like, we immediately adopted PGS. We adopted day 3 biopsy. And, we started, giving that to all the patients because we thought this was going to be, and we, not the me part of we, but, collectively, we said this was going to be, the quick answer to getting all the patients pregnant. And if you had a euploid embryo, then that would equal a baby. And it was never going to be a binary scenario. Normal does not equal baby. And so we've done ourselves a bit of a disservice by kind of jumping into a lot of these things simply because we have these very desperate humans in front of us that just so badly want to be a parent, and that we're willing to do nearly anything. And so there's great debate about, quote unquote add-ons, and, whether this has been validated, and, part of the problem also is that we don't have, we don't do human embryo research in this country. We really don't do prospective randomized trials. We don't cycle thousands of patients in IVF just for the purposes of research. We don't do that. So we have to go backwards and say, we've taken all of these other treatment cycles and kind of extrapolate backwards. So we've done some level of prospective randomization with, maybe we're trying a new drug, or maybe we're trying a new, mostly, I would say mostly this falls into, into drugs, or maybe it's a different, sort of a PGS test or something. We're trying to validate, whether or not it's a better or worse element, but we're not doing it in such a way that we're not doing it under a diagnostic scheme. And so it lends a little bit of a, well, this worked for this patient, so maybe it's going to work for all of these other patients. And again, we're willing to throw almost the kitchen sink at some of these people because we just so desperately want to help them. It doesn't, there's a way to, and I think that conversation is starting now. I think we're having that conversation about, how do we kind of across the board bring some higher level of accountability. We have electronic witnessing systems. We have certain things that we're saying, what, we're double checking our work, and we're giving, the patients what we think is kind of, we're doing what we can is what within reason to make sure that we're providing, the care and the service that at the best that we can.
Cynthia, how many clinics have Tomorrow system in the US?
We've signed over 50 clinics, so we have about 20% of the market right now. We're installing at this point weekly, and we're going to open our second offsite storage place at towards the end of this year. So it is being, there's an element of change management. Again, what Dave was saying, if it's not broken, don't fix it. This is working perfectly, and I think that's a really safe way to go. And I think it's the right attitude to take, like, what is this really going to improve my operations? Is it going to improve my accountability? Is it going to give me something that I don't currently have that I'm more or less willing to adopt, that new technology? Is it going to help me, or isn't it? And if I think that everything is running smoothly, then that's not something I'm going to look for. It's not, I haven't identified a problem, so I'm not looking for a solution. So I think we had those very publicized 2 catastrophic, events, and we've had other events that, I'm sure Kim has done these. I've personally been subject matter experts in cases where things have not gone as smoothly as they should have. But none of you are ever going to hear about it because these things get settled generally out of court and get put away. So I actually have to write this week a report on a case that I got asked to be a subject matter expert. So it's, I think that the problems happen more than, the public knows about. And I think that, I think generally collectively owe it to ourselves to kind of keep pushing ourselves to raise the bar.
Awesome. So actually, we don't have any more questions. I don't know if the speakers want to say their last words, or we can finish our webinar.
I would just say thanks for Progenesis and the team, and David and Kim and everybody, and Fernanda and Sheila, and Nabil. Thanks so much for inviting me, and thanks for this great discussion. And I think we need more of these discussions. I think, we're all trying to do our best. We're all trying to do the right thing. And I think, we're in this together. So we have to, we need this collaboration. We need this ability to talk about not just, hey, this is working really well. Like, we have to talk about what's not working really well. And we have to kind of collectively, get ourselves into a place where we're all moving forward.
David, Cragun.
Yep, just wanted to say thanks for inviting me. Appreciate it.
Dr. Kimball Pomeroy.
I would just say you have to be able to convince your physicians that the investment that they make in securing these cryostorage specimens is going to be well worth it. Because if one of these accidents would have happened to one of them, they would now be bankrupt. And I would also say that Cynthia is correct. There are so many more of these cases that never come to light because once they're settled, one or both of the parties to it put a gag order on what were the results of the settlement. And so we never hear what happened in the settlement. We only hear usually what happened if the case went to a jury.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Thank you for your participation. Before we close the session, I will just announce our next webinar that's going to happen on August 9th. It's going to be with the team from India, Progenesis India, and it's going to be about the IVF success, understanding endometrium as a predictive factor, with Dr. Pune Rana Arora and Dr. Rajni and me as co-moderator. So we are going to discuss the role of endometrium as a predictive factor for fertility and discuss if it has a major role in embryo implantation during IVF. It's going to be again on August 9th, but at 5 p.m. Indian time, which is going to be 3 a.m. Pacific time and 6 a.m. East time. So I hope we can attend, everybody can attend. If not, it's going to be on YouTube. Thank you very much, everybody, for the participation.
And thank you to our speakers. Excellent discussions and just a positive perspective. So I really enjoyed it. We really appreciate it. And I know our audience did too. And thank you to the audience for joining us. We appreciate very much your support. And this is how we can continue to provide more and more of these interactive sessions. Everyone have a great evening and we will see you next time in a month's time.
Yeah, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good night.